Okay, well, I want to welcome everyone here. It's a wonderful turnout for the first of 3 lectures. Let me mute everyone. So I'm going to mute people who are not the speaker. And at the end of the lecture, we'll allow people to unmute themselves. As I was saying, it's a pleasure to have everyone here and to have a great speaker like Amaury Lambert speaking. He'll give a series of 3 lectures this week, next week, and the following week, and then we'll have a week off, and then Alison Etheridge will give another series of 3 lectures. And the broad subject will be on the interactions between biology and probability, which is all the more relevant these days as we sit at home thinking about the implications of that. So as far as how things will go, if you have questions, you should put them in the group chat. If a question can be answered by people in the chat, then that will work. And if necessary, otherwise, I or another host will ask Amaury the question. At the end of the talk, we'll have a chance for an active question period, and we'll also join together in applauding the talk. The last thing I want to say is that this series of talks is a joint venture organized through Columbia University through the Irving Institute for Cancer Dynamics that Simon Tavaré is in charge of, and the Probability in Society initiative that I'm leading. And so we hope that there'll be many more of these sorts of activities over time, and we really appreciate everyone attending. So with that, let me pass this off to Amaury, who will start the first of his lectures.
All right, thank you very much, Ivan. So the title of this series of 3 lectures is Evolutionary Processes and Patterns of Biodiversity. And today I will talk about the genealogy of one gene, how can we model that, and why is it important for predicting diversity, and also how models can couple the genealogies of several genes. So as you can see from this first slide, I'm a professor at Sorbonne Université, but I also have a research group at Collège de France. It's called SMILE for, as you can see on the bottom, stochastic models for the influence of life evolution. It started 9 years ago, and during these lectures, I will mainly talk, as far as my research is concerned, I will mainly talk about works that has been done in collaboration with the very talented people that I have had the luck to collaborate with during these years. So just to explain why evolution and models, I would like to emphasize the fact that the discoverers of the notion, the theory of evolution, the reality of evolution, Lamarck, Wallace, and Darwin, especially Darwin, because he identified the very mechanisms of evolution and supported his theory with a wealth of evidence. But he was not the only one. Actually, a lot of researchers at the time knew that biodiversity, as we know it, was a result of a process and was not like fixed and given. And that this process had some generic properties. And because it has some generic properties, it lends itself to modeling. And as you can see from the two bullet points, there are 2 kinds of models. And basically, the first lecture today will talk about models of microevolution of population genetics, which is concerned with the let's say, the variation through time of frequencies of given types, genetic types, inside a population of the same species. And the second type of models are models of macroevolution for really the appearance, the emergence of new species. And I provided you with some like celebrated papers that were seminal in both these fields. I love the cartoons on the left. You see the cartoon by Darwin, which is quite well known, showing the descendants with modification. And the other cartoon is less well known, but I think it's interesting. It's the first simulation of a phylogenetic tree showing the emergence of new genera, and the number of species inside them. So let me introduce the topic. So the basic question that I want to address today is as follows. So assume that you can sample n individuals from a population. So you sample n, I don't know, crabs or clams on the beach, or I don't know, like maybe 10 spiders or 10 apples or olives, and then you sequence their DNA. Okay? You sequence their DNA, and the question that I want to address is what diversity you expect to observe in this sample of DNA sequencing. Actually, the short answer is that you will observe this. It's called a multiple sequence alignment, and basically each row is a different DNA sequence. So each column is the site on the sequence, okay? And so you can compare all these sequences by the colors. Each of the 4 colors corresponds to one of the 4 nucleotides, A, T, G, and C, all right? And of course, the long answer is much longer. It's the topic of this lecture. And so there are 2 things that I want to insist on. Is that diversity, genetic diversity in your sample is caused by 2 main factors. The first, of course, are mutations, right? If there are differences between these sequences due to mutation, and the higher the mutation rate, the larger the diversity in your sample. It's easy to understand. The second factor is the genealogy. The genealogy between the individuals in your sample. It's easy also to understand that the closely related they are, the more closely related they are, and the less diversity you will see in the sample. Okay. So what's the genealogy? A genealogy, so this genealogical tree is actually not what we are going to consider, at least for now. In the first part of this lecture, we will not consider these so-called pedigrees, which are genealogies with 2 parents, but we will only consider genealogies with 1 parent, okay? Because one locus, which is a location on the genome, may be small enough for not undergoing recombination, maybe a single site on the genome has only 1 parent, okay? And so I will use this term locus, which is very widespread in genetics and in genomics, and has several meanings. Basically, a generic word for a small location of the genome. And since it's inherited from 1 single parent, the genealogy is much simpler than the pedigree that you see on the bottom right panel. Of course, now if you look at different loci, you have to remember that half of our genes come from our mother and the other half come from our father. And so if you iterate this to your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, you will understand that different loci, different genes on your genome have different genealogies. In diploid species, each chromosome is in 2 copies in each cell. And each parent contributes one copy of each chromosome, as you know. And so the 2 copies of each of these chromosomes have different ancestry. One comes from your father, and the other one from your mother. And you can iterate this to other generations, okay, further back in time. But actually, even loci that are located on the same chromosome don't have the same genealogy. They cannot have the same genealogy. And this is due to recombination, a topic that I will also consider in the following. So the outline of the talk is as follows. I will first address or show models for the genealogy of 1 gene, and in particular insist on coalescence theory, which is a very powerful tool in this field. Then I will use these models to predict patterns of genetic diversity and 1 locus, and I will insist on the relation to population size, because relatedness increases or decreases the diversity and is also linked to population size. Then I will talk about models coupling genealogies of several genes, and I will show you 2 applications. The first application is really an application, right? It has some implications on the real world and how we understand it. How does genome-wide diversity inform us on the past demography? You will see that it's amazing how we can do that. And the second question is a more theoretical question, and the drawing here, or the figure here, is here to illustrate this. Imagine that you start with 1 population and that you paint the genome of each ancestor in a different color, and then you let recombination mix the colors of these genomes, how would the mosaic of colors in the population look like in the long run? And the amusing thing is that actually it's a question that we have partly answered with collaborators of ours. And it was inspired by this experimental evolution, which result is shown on the figure with 16 colors, 16 ancestors. And here you see 300 sequences with different colors on the chromosome corresponding to different ancestry. So let's start with the genealogy of one gene. So we need a model for that, and there is a very well-known model called the Canning's model, which is neutral in the sense that there is no natural selection ongoing here. And so you assume that for simplicity, the size of the population is constant, fixed equal to some capital N, which is assumed to be large, all right? Then to each individual I in generation T, you give new IT children. And these children are part of generation T plus 1. Okay, so you're left with this random genealogy here. And Canning's model is a model where you assume that all these vectors of numbers of children at generation T, are independent copies of the same vector, nu1, nu2, nu_n. Of course, they are different values, but they are drawn from the same distribution, where, of course, since you want the population size to remain constant, the sum of the new i's has to be equal to n. And because you don't want natural selection to come into play, you want the law of nu1, nu2, nu_n to be invariant by permutation, meaning that every individual plays the same role. Okay, in probability theory, we say that this law is exchangeable. A specific instance of the Canning's model that I will use repeatedly in the following is called the Wright-Fisher model, where nu1, nu_n is multinomial with parameters n, 1 over n, 1 over n. This actually means that each individual in generation T plus 1 picks her parent uniformly and independently in generation T. Okay, so remember that, Wright-Fisher model is very simple. Take each individual at generation T plus 1, and you pick the parent from generation T uniformly and independently. So let me now present coalescence theory just for 2 individuals. Assume that you are at some generation at fixed time, since the genealogy, as you saw in Canning's model and a fortiori for Wright-Fisher model, is stationary in time. It can be any time. You sample 2 individuals uniformly at random, and you follow their ancestors backwards in time, exactly as on the cartoon on the bottom panel. You let T sub n of 2 be the number of generations counted backwards until the 2 lineages find their most recent common ancestor, MRCA. Okay, so you follow the lineages of these genes. Recall that we are only interested in 1 locus, so we don't need 2 parents. You just need to consider 1 parent per individual. And you can follow these lineages until you find 2 sisters. And when you find 2 sisters, generation afterwards, they find their most recent one ancestor. So you see that Tn of 2 is geometric with success probability, the probability that 2 random lineages, random individuals, are sisters. Okay, call that C sub n. In the Wright-Fisher model, of course, C sub n is just 1 over n. Otherwise, you can express C sub n as a function of the new i's, for example, by writing the first here, the first expression, which tells you the probability, which breaks down into the probability of falling for 2 individuals to fall into the same sisterhood, and then using exchangeability to get the third expression. And now, if Cn goes to 0 as n tends to infinity, then your geometric random variable goes to an exponential random variable when you rescale it by 1 over Cn to an exponential with parameter 1. In the Wright-Fisher model, Tn of 2 is big of n, and Tn of 2 over n converges in distribution to an exponential random variable with parameter 1. Okay? So remember that in these population models, the time to most recent common ancestor are of the order of 1 over Cn. In the Wright-Fisher model, of the order of 1 over in the order of capital N. Okay. So now, what happens for small n individuals? So you assume that you sample small n individuals uniformly at random, and you do the same. Okay, you follow their ancestors backwards in time. Now we have to use two quantities. The first, you already know it, probability that 2 random individuals are sisters. And now D sub n is the probability that 3 random individuals are sisters. Okay, and probability that when you sample 3 individuals at random, they have the same value. In particular, in the Wright-Fisher model, Dn is 1 over n squared. And the theorem, which is due to Muller, tells you the convergence for all these models under the assumption that Dn over n over Cn goes to 0, which is the case in the Wright-Fisher model. The genealogy of the sample converges when you rescale it by C sub n. Okay, remember that you have to count time in the time scale of 1 over Cn. Okay, so if you rescale by 1 over Cn, then you get convergence of the genealogy to Kingman's coalescent. Before I describe what is Kingman's coalescent, just look at the bottom panel where you see 4 realizations of this tree. Okay, so it's a binary tree, and so as you go from the bottom to the top, you see less and less lineages. And now the description tells you that the waiting time T of k from k to k minus 1 lineages is exponential with parameter k choose 2. Okay, so you recover the previous result with k equals 2. And of course, the next coalescing pair is chosen uniformly at random. Okay, so it amounts to saying that each pair of lineages coalesces independently at rate 1. Now, this is for the case when the population size is constant through time. But imagine that the population size is of the order of some scaling factor capital N, but fluctuates through time on time scales of the order of n. Okay, so basically it means that the population size at time t is n times x of nt, where x is some smooth function of time. Then the rate at which 2 lineages coalesce is 1 over x of t. Okay, and it makes sense. The larger the population and the smaller the coalescence rate. All right. So you see that under this assumption that dn over cn goes to 0, which again holds under the Wright-Fisher model, you see that you don't get multiple mergers. The resulting tree in the limit is binary. You also see that the waiting times are smaller when there are a large number of lineages, okay? So shorter edge lengths close to present, close to the tips. Also, this model is sampling consistent. What does this mean? It means that if you start from a tree with n plus 1 tips, you take one of these tips away, you look now at what the tree spanned by the n tips that remain, and what you get is exactly the Kingman coalescent with n tips. Okay, so it's called sampling consistent. And also note that the genealogy of small n individuals, exactly as in the case when n equals 2, has a length and a depth, which is of the order of capital N in the Wright-Fisher model, of the order of 1 over c sub n in the general case. And I've added this note just for a mathematical purpose that the usual way the Kingman coalescent or these trees are represented is by a partition valued process, where the state of the process at time t is the partition into blocks where I and j are in the same block if they have found their most common recent common ancestor at time t, right? So this block is actually a subtree. Now, just a quick result that I will use in my third lecture. So the fact that if you look at what happens when the number of tips goes to infinity. So we record that the process counting the number of lineages in the coalescent is a pure depth process, okay, because it's a binary tree. It goes from k to k minus 1 at rate k choose 2. And so this means that the sum of all waiting times is finite because it has finite expectation. So this pure depth process can be started at infinity and reaches finite values in finite time, okay? And of course, the same is true for the Kingman coalescent. You can start it at the partition into singletons of capital N, and you get what is called the standard coalescent. So now let's go for the patterns of genetic diversity that are predicted by this model. So don't look at the text here, just look at the cartoon. Okay, so the cartoon is actually not very clear, but so the idea is that here you have a genealogy on 9 individuals. All right. Each of these individuals is endowed with the sequence.
Omar, can I ask a question from the last slide? So if you just go back to the previous slide. Yeah. So is there a sort of limit shape phenomena that arises? You know, it seems like you have, you know, this random death process, but if you kind of zoom out and, you know, look up at infinity, do you get a nice, you know, smooth curve?
Yeah, so I will talk about that in my third lecture. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Thank you. So let's go back to this genealogy with mutations. Each dot represents a mutation event, okay? And each mutation occurs at some site on the sequence. So you see the result on the 2 sequences here that I have sketched, which are called haplotypes. Haplotypes are instances of the sequence. And you see that individual 3 carries 3 mutations at sites C, E, G, and H. All right, because you see that on its lineage, from the root to individual 3, there are 4 mutations hitting sites G, C, H, and E. Okay. But now you have to bear in mind that, so what you can only do is compare the sequences. Okay, so mutations are visible if they are present in a number of individuals equal to K, where K is between A and N-1. Okay, if a mutation is carried by everyone, you don't see it in the sample. You cannot differentiate it from the ancestral state. Okay, for example, A here is not mutated. Everybody carries the ancestral state. But G is mutated for everyone. So everyone carried the derived state. You cannot see the difference when you see the data, all right? So the only mutations that are visible in the sample, they are called polymorphic or segregating. They must occur within the genealogical tree. And I recall that the length of the tree is big O of n, okay? So now I will stick with the Wright-Fisher model, okay? So the total length of the tree is big O of n. So it means that for mutations to be visible in the sample of in your multiple sequence alignments, you have to have the probability of gene-wide mutation at birth lie in some Goldilocks zone. If NUN is much smaller than 1, you will see no segregating site in the sample. Everybody will carry the same sequence. If NUN is much larger than 1, you will see infinitely many segregating sites in the sample. Basically, all the sequences will be totally different. Nothing will be common. But now the Goldilocks zone is where NUN is big O of 1. Then you will see a finite number of mutations, conditional on tree length, of course. In the limit, it will be a Poisson random variable. Now, if you assume this, and the sequence is long enough, then mutations all occur at different sites. Okay, if actually the mutation rates are not so different when you range over the sequence, then all mutations occur at different sites, and it's called the infinitely many site model. Okay, so you have mutations that each time hit a different site. Now, if you look at the result, if you look at the sequence called haplotype that each of the individuals in the sample carries, then each mutation gives rise to a new haplotype. And so it's called, for this reason, it's also called the infinitely many allele model. All right? Okay, so let me introduce some notation. So recall that the population size is fixed, equal to capital N. We need NUN to be of the order of 1, so I can assume that UN is equal to theta over 2n, where theta is some parameter. And now it's easy to see that as n goes to infinity, you get convergence of the genealogy with mutations to Kingman's coalescence with Poissonian marks occurring at rate theta over 2 on the lineages of the tree. Okay? So in the limit, we don't care about the details of the model. We have some universal some universal limit, which is this binary random tree with Poissonian marks. Okay. And then to characterize the genetic diversity of the sample, there are various things that you can do, various quantities that you can define. The first, S sub n, is the number of polymorphic sites, also equal to sum over k of Sn of k, where Sn of k is the number of polymorphic sites carried by exactly k individuals. Okay. So for each site, you know how many individuals carries it. All those which are carried by k, you put them into one basket, and you count the number of these such sites. You put that Sn of k. The knowledge of Sn of k as k ranges from 1 to n-1 is called the site frequency spectrum. I won't talk very much about it, but it's a very important quantity in population genetics. Note that conditional on total tree length L sub n, Sn is Poisson with parameter theta ln over 2. Okay, so it's very simple to characterize the distribution. Now, if you look at A sub n, it's the number of distinct haplotypes, okay, the number of distinct sequences. It can also be written as the sum of an of k, where an of k is the number of haplotypes carried by k individuals. And this time, the knowledge of an of k as k ranges from 1 to n, not n-1, because everybody can carry the same sequence. You get what is known as the allele frequency spectrum. Okay? A haplotype is also called an allele. And since haplotypes induce a partition of the sample called the allelic partition, the sum of k an of k must be equal to small n. Okay? So different ways of characterizing the genetic diversity in the sample. Either you count the polymorphic sites and by how many individuals they are carried, or you count the number of haplotypes, or you count the number of haplotypes carried by exactly k individuals.
Amaury, can I clarify some of these definitions just to make sure I understand? So the total tree length is that if you sum over all of the different branches, right? So it's the total number of sum points, the whole tree.
Up to most recent common ancestor. Sorry, I should have specified.
Okay, and when the difference between a polymorphic site and the number of haploids. So the polymorphic sites are just sites where there's a difference.
Exactly. So you just look at one column, and if this column has 2 or more colors, here always 2, has 2 colors, you remember the multiple sequence alignments, you say that this site is polymorphic or separated. Okay.
And the number of distinct haploids. So what is a distinct haploid again?
So a haplotype is really the knowledge of a sequence. Okay, so you look at all your sequence, some of them are exactly similar. They carry exactly the same mutation.
Oh, okay.
So you have to see the same colors, and some are different.
GFB is the name of GFB.
Yeah. Okay. Is that clear? Yeah. Okay. All right, so there was a very well-known result characterizing the law of the allelic partition, and it's called Ewan sampling formula. I will try to walk you through a simple proof that is very well explained in the book by Rick Durrett about models for DNA sequence evolution. So remember that we look at this coalescent here on the right panel, an N coalescent, so starting with N individuals with Poissonian mutations. And recall that each mutation gives rise to a new type, right? Because we're in infinitely many sites or infinitely many allele model. And so we don't really care about mutations. We only care, about the first mutations that we encounter when we go from the tip to the root. Okay, and so these mutations are colored. The mutations that occur before have no incidence on the haplotypes. They have an incidence on the sites, on the polymorphic sites, but not on the haplotypes. Okay, if you only want to know the allelic partition, you can just freeze the coalescent as soon as it encounters one mutation. And so you're left with a coalescent which has a pairwise rate 1, so basically a quadratic rate with deaths that occur at rate theta over 2. Now, if you reverse time and you change time, you go from a quadratic rate to a linear rate, and to a linear rate to a constant rate, you get a birth process, rate 1, with immigration. migration, sorry, rate, yeah, rate theta. Yeah, that's correct. And so basically the partition that you see here on the right panel, you can also get it by a birth process with immigration, each immigration being a different type, okay? A third equivalent way of characterizing the partition is called the Chinese restaurant process. It's also a very well-known and studied process model in probability theory. And it's a partition into tables of the restaurant. So when the K+1 customer enters the dining room, you assume that she sits next to customer I with probability 1 over K plus theta. There are already K individuals in the room. So if you sum, you get K over K plus theta. Or she sits at an empty table, meaning a new type, with probability theta over K plus theta. Okay, these three models are equivalent. And using either of these three models, you can get this theorem due to Warren-Ewens, which gives you exactly the formula for the law of A n of 1, A n of n. Okay. Actually, I think it's simpler to use the formulation which is on the bottom left, which tells you that A n of 1, A n of 2, A n of n has the same law as the vector y1, y2, yn conditional on the sum of k, yk equals n due to the allelic partition, where the yks are independent, and a yk follows a Poisson distribution with parameter theta over k. Okay, so it's also known as the harmony of the harmonic frequency spectrum because it decreases like 1 over k. Okay, so we have many singletons, many pairs, a little less triples, etc. Okay. And now another thing which is interesting is what happens when you look at a large sample. When you look at a large sample, you can prove that Sn and An are both of the order of theta log n. So as n grows, you see a saturation of the number of new types that you observe in your sample. Also, when you look at small families, mutations that are carried by a small number of individuals, which are actually basically the most recent mutations that occur close to the tips of the tree, you lose the conditioning, and An of k converges in distribution to a Poisson random variable with parameter theta over k. But what's even more interesting is large families. So the large families are the mutations, well, by family I mean all individuals carrying the same haplotype. The large families are due to mutation that occur close to the root. Okay? When a mutation occurs close to the root and there's no mutation under it, it's carried by a lot of individuals in the sample. Okay? And it's actually a result which is due to Donnelly and Tavare, but it's a general result which is inherent to the Chinese restaurant process. And it tells you that the sizes of the oldest families, so the oldest mutations, the mutations that have occurred in the tree most closer to the root, closest to the root, they're all of the order of n. Okay, they represent a macroscopic fraction of the sample, and you can characterize their law when you rescale xn of k by n, by small n, the size of the sample. You get a convergent to what is known as the gem vector for Griffith, Engen, and McCloskey, pk, where pk is defined by the by the formula of the slide, thanks to an independent sequence of zi, which are all beta, 1 theta random variables. It's simpler to understand this as what is called the stick breaking procedure, where you start by throwing in the unit interval Z1. Okay? And Z1 tells you the frequency, gives you P1 is the frequency of the oldest family in your sample. Okay, so it's a macroscopic fraction of the sample, the oldest one. To get the second oldest, you get rid of the leftmost part, and you throw again a new independent beta random variable into the interval, the remaining interval, and you get the second oldest. And you do that again and again, and you see that what you get is what is called the mass partition of the unit interval, which sums to 1. Okay. So you have this, let's say, a dual description of the small families which really behave like a harmonic spectrum, and the oldest families that, if you see this as a spectrum, are just like small columns on your histograms, which are far apart on the right. But if you look if you characterize them this way, you get a very nice limit. Now, let's go to the application I mentioned about estimating population size. Recall that, as I said briefly, when population size increases, when you sample uniformly individuals from this population, their relatedness will decrease, right? The chance that you have sampled, say, relatives decreasing. And so the diversity of the sample increases. Actually, what we've seen is that the diversity, when it's measured by the number of polymorphic sites, increases linearly with population size. Indeed, if mutation probability UN is known, you can measure it by diverse procedures. Of course, it varies through time and along the sequence, but let's say it's known. Then any estimator of theta, since theta is equal to 2nu, it yields an estimate of n. Okay, and for example, the Waterstone estimator tells you that Sn over log n is an estimator of theta. All right, and so you see this linear relationship between theta or n and the diversity, the number of polymorphic sites. Okay, now that's for, let's say that this is for integrating over all genealogies, all possible genealogies. Okay, so the results that I presented previously are by integrating over the law of the Kingman coalescence. But now assume that you know the genealogy. The genealogy predicts genetic diversity, but also on the other way around, genealogy can be inferred from genetic diversity. For example, if you take n equals 2, the probability of identity, the probability of finding the same sequences, the same haplotypes, called homozygosity, or to have the same value of the site, same base on the two sites. It's 1 minus un over 2n over 2n of 2, sorry, to the 2 tn of 2, because the total number of generations to the time to t MRCA, you have to go back to go from the tips to the roots and to the roots from the tips, and you want no mutation to have occurred on this path. And so you see the relation between the probability of homozygosity and Tn of 2. Okay, so imagine that you have one genealogy for the whole sequence, and you look at the fraction of sites that are homozygous, meaning identical by state, or heterozygous, meaning two different states, and you get an estimator of their time to most recent common ancestor. Okay? So if you assume that n is constant, and that the value, as I just said, of the time to most recent common ancestor can be estimated from the diversity that you observe, then since Tn is geometric with parameter 1 over n, an estimator of capital N is just 1 over Tn. Okay? So let me go through this again. You look at the diversity of your sample. You assume that you have means, like previously explained, of inferring the time to most recent common ancestor. Then the population size can be estimated by 1 over this time. And now if the population size is not constant, remember what I've shown earlier. If it varies through time, like n times x of nt, where x is a smooth function of time, then you get this formula for the limiting distribution of Tn over n. And so you see the dependence between the distribution of Tn of 2, time to most recent common ancestor, and the fluctuations of population size. Now recall that different genes have different genealogies. So in theory, the distribution instead of the value of Tn of 2, not the value, but the distribution, can be estimated from diversity at, let's say, many independent loci, then the variations of n through time could be inferred. Okay, not only the value of n, but their variations. All right. So it requires understanding how genealogies of different genes are coupled. And this is what I'm going to go through now. So here, the example of a bottleneck, just before I go through the models with recombination. When you see here a provisional reduction in population size called bottleneck, then you see that you will see coalescence time that will be more often than not exactly at the moment of the bottleneck, and so density of coalescence times will peak at bottleneck time. So let's couple these genealogies of different loci. So to do this, we need to consider the Wright-Fisher model, but with recombination and two parents. Okay. So assume that you have constant population size, but now you have two parents per individual, and each individual carries one chromosome. You can assume that this chromosome mathematically is a sequence of sites, a discrete sequence, or the interval 0, 1, any linear object. And at each generation, each individual chooses her two parents uniformly at random, exactly as in the Wright-Fisher model with one parent. Now you have to decide, since each individual carries one chromosome, and you have two parents, you have to decide what chromosome does the child carry. So I have two possibilities. The first possibility is with probability rho over n, where rho is called the recombination rate. The two parental chromosomes recombine, and you uniformly throw some points in the chromosome, and you mix the two colors, okay? And you get what you see in the middle of the figure, okay? Otherwise, only one of the two chromosomes is passed on with uniform probability. Okay, so most of the time you just draw one of the two chromosomes and you pass it, or you recombine the two chromosomes at some uniformly distributed cut point called crossover. Okay, and so when you see this picture,
Amaury, what does this uniformly distributed crossover mean exactly? So, like, if you were combining not just a pure orange and green or blue, you know, if you had something that already had a mix, how would you define the crossover between them?
So I didn't hear very well, but I can answer that. Okay, so for simplicity, we assume that the point where we mix the two colors is uniform, but it could be any distribution. And of course, in reality, there are actually recombination hotspots where you know that recombination has a larger probability to occur. Actually, it even changes through evolutionary time. But here, for simplicity, we assume that the point where you mix orange and green here is uniform. Is that clear?
Yeah, I guess. But you know, if the two parents themselves were not just pure green and pure orange, if they themselves were, you know, a mixture, do you do then a superposition?
Okay. So for now, like, forget about state, okay? You forget about the state, but assume, so you just take one of the, of course, they might be of the same color, okay? So if the two are blue, then whatever happens, you get a blue chromosome, okay? Yeah. So yeah, so if you look at that, you see that a site which is, let's say, on the top of the chromosome and a site which is at the bottom of this vertical chromosome they have two different parents. Okay, they have two different parents. One comes the father and the other comes from the mother. All right. So the coalescent now will change. Okay, and the coalescent now it's called the ancestral recombination graph. So assume that you just have these two sites. And just have one individual. You sample one individual, and you look at the lineages of two sites on its chromosome, her chromosome. Assume that there are distance L, and you follow the ancestry as time goes backward, just as on the right panel. So at each generation, the common line of descent of this block splits with probability which is proportional to rho over n, the probability of recombination, times L, which is the distance between these two sites. Okay? So most of the time, as you can see, the first two generations, they are in the same individual, and after two generations, one goes to the father and the other goes into the mother, all right? And then as n goes to infinity, the time rescale, and of course you have singleton, you have, coalescences with probability 1 over n. And so when you rescale time, the ancestral recombination graph just has two states. Either the two lineages of your two sites are in the same individual, or they are in two different individuals. And the rates are rho L and 1. Okay? if you look at 3 sites, it's a little bit more involved. So you start with 3 sites, let's say green, blue, and red. And then this block, so they all follow the same individuals. They all come from father, mother, and at some point there is a recombination. So recombination occurs at a rate which is proportional to rho L2, which is equal in the time rescale process to rho L2 between XY on the one hand and Z on the other hand, and to rho L1 for let's say separating the green on the one hand and the red and the blue on the other hand. Okay, and when they're separated, as you can see on the cartoon, block XY will split into 2 at rate rho L1. Block YZ at rate rho L2, but block XZ, at rate L1 plus L2, okay? Because the sites are distant of L1 plus L2, okay? And of course, each pair of lines coalesces at rate 1. So you see that if you look at you sample one individual, you can characterize the state of your ancestral recombination graph on these K sites, here K equals 3, by a Markov process, which is valued in the partitions of 1K, but here has a total different meaning than the Kingman coalescent. It means that all the integers are in the same block correspond to all sites that are in the same individual at that time. Okay.
Could you just say, so the vertical direction in your picture is time. What does the horizontal direction exactly mean?
So there's no horizontal direction as in the other cartoons. It's just each row is a population. So each row corresponds to a generation. And there are here like 10 individuals in each generation. Keep the population size equal to capital N constant. So there's no order on the x-axis. Okay. Of course, the lines I chose to not let them cross, but there's no. They could cross, right? They could intersect these lines.
Okay, so the fact that they kind of look like sticky Brownian motions or sticky processes is just the way.
Yeah, it's just the effect of trying to make it like a clear figure, but yeah, maybe it's confusing. So if you sample now more than one individual, it becomes even more involved, because now in addition, the same color lines, when they come into the same individual, they coalesce into one single line. Okay. And so you get this kind of picture. I won't go into the details of the, let's say, of the rates of this, and even the state space of this process. But you can observe that the green and blue loci, they have the same time to most recent common ancestor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You see that the green and the red locus, they find their most recent common ancestor, and they have exactly the same tree until their most recent common ancestor. Whereas the red locus, because of the recombination that occurs on the right, on the bottom right after 2 generations, has a different history, and so has a time to most recent common ancestor, which is 4 generations later. Do you see that? So the ancestral recombination graph is a way of accounting for the fact that different sites, different loci on your genome may have different ancestries, as I tried to show on the first picture, the most simple picture where you just have one chromosome 2 chromosomes being recombined. And because of this, you can assume that you can have in mind a picture where you move along the chromosome and you see a sequence of trees, right? You forget about what happens upstream of the most recent common ancestor, okay? Just look at the tree of each of these sites, each of these loci. So the green and the red, they have exactly the same tree. Okay, so here it's just a cherry. It's a tree with 2 tips. But the red has a different tree. And called IBD segment for identical by descent, a maximal connected segment of sites which share exactly the same genealogy. So basically this looks like this. So here you have small n equals 4. The IBD segments are segments with the same color. The dependencies between these trees is complex, as you saw, and you see that you see that you have maximal segments that share the same genealogy, and even if you don't care or didn't get the details in the previous slides, the important point is that these trees are different because of recombination. Okay? If there was no recombination, all the genome would have the same genealogy. Okay? Because of recombination, all these loci can have different genealogies. And another important point is that shallow trees, like the red one here in the middle, are carried by a longer IBD segment. Because when the most recent common ancestor is recent, the probability of observing a recombination from between now and the MRCA is small. So because this probability is small, the segment is larger. Okay? So maybe forget about the law of this tree sequence. Actually, it's quite complicated, but bear in mind this idea that for a sample of sequences, you have a succession of IBD segments which carry the same genealogy, and the longer segments correspond to shallow trees. So now let's talk about two applications. So as I just said, the ARG, the ancestral recombination graph, shows complex dependencies between the gene trees, okay, the trees of different loci. And so for applications, McVean and Cardin in 2005 proposed an approximation which is called the SMC for sequentially Markovian coalescent, which gives you a Markovian approximation to the ARG as we move along the chromosome. Okay, so it's a sequence of trees which is Markovian along the chromosome, and the law that they proposed the following: you start from a gene tree with total length capital L. You weight an exponential distance on the chromosome with parameter rho L, because rho is the recombination rate. And at this point, at the end of this IBD segment, so for this whole distance, you keep the same tree. And at this distance rho L, you change the tree. How do you change the tree? You throw a uniform point in the tree, you detach the lineage, and you regraft it as in the coalescent. Okay, so you see here succession of trees. And you see the transition represented on the right panel. And now I would like to talk to you about what I think is really a tour de force done by Lee and Durbin in 2011, which amounts to basically inferring the history of human population thanks to one single genome. Sorry, one single individual. Why am I saying this? Because one individual is one diploid genome, and so it's basically two sequences. And what they've done is the following. They considered SMC, but for just two individuals, so it's called pairwise SMC, PSMC. And the idea is to infer the past variations of population size from these two sequences by a hidden Markov model, where the hidden state is the time to most recent common ancestor. So what they do is that they infer the IBD segments, and these IBD segments have the same TMRCA, and depending on the density of heterozygous sites, you can see on the right, the sites where the two sequences show different states, they can infer the time to most recent common ancestor exactly as what I suggested a couple of slides ago. And the idea is that a shallow tree corresponds to a long segment with a low density of heterozygous sites, and a deep tree corresponds to a short segment with a high density of heterozygous sites. You can see that on the bottom panel, where you see long IBD segments with a small TMRCA and a very short segment with a deep TMRCA. And from the TMRCA, of course, they can infer the time to the variations of the population size, as I tried to explain 5 or 6 slides ago. And here what they got. So here they have 6 genomes, 6 diploid genomes. And the red and the green are of African descent. They are Yoruba people. And you see that they differ, their history of the population size of their ancestors differs from the Asian and European genomes. Various conclusions, they've drawn various conclusions, including let's say the last one, which is the most interesting for the 10 minutes that are left. You see that around 100,000, so 10 to the 5 years ago, you see that they infer an elevated population size. Okay? Actually, what they think is that it's an artifact due to the structure of the population in Africa at that time that is believed to involve small, isolated populations that were separately evolving. So why is that? Because if you stick to this picture of lineages going back in time and coalescing when they find their most recent common ancestor, if they travel in a large population, you will wait a long time until they find that time to most recent common ancestor. If they travel inside small subpopulations which are separately evolving, then they will get trapped into these subpopulations, and you will also wait a long time until you find their most recent common ancestor. And so these deep TMRCAs can be either due to a large population size or to a population substructure. So just for the 5 to 10 minutes that are left, I want just to mention 2 works that we've been doing, that we've published this year in the group. First work was about a quantitative assessment of extinction risk, thanks to this kind of technique. In 2015, we published a paper on the assessment of extinction risk, thanks to survey data of 200 species. And we realized that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature used very poor statistical tools to do this assessment. And so we had the idea of using genomic tools to do that. And so here's a proof of concept, where the goal is to detect a decline from kappa N0 to N0, tau N0 generations ago, where N0 is some scaling factor. So we cannot choose PSMC because the source of signal on the IPD segment for very recent time to most recent common ancestor is quite weak. And so we used another statistical measure, which we call the maximum LD block, LD standing for linkage disequilibrium, where an MLD block is the maximal segment where the mutations that you see on your multiple sequence alignment are compatible with a single tree. Doesn't mean that it was actually an IBD segment, but in the data, they're compatible with the same tree. And so what we showed is that the normalized distribution of MLD block lengths that you can very simply and rapidly infer from the data is insensitive to population size when you rescale by the segment mean, but it is sensitive to population size variations. Should mention that it's the work of Élise Cardon-Cuff with our PhD student co-supervised by Guillaume Achaz. And so you see on the top panel, the distributions of MLD block lengths. So the gray and the white correspond to 2 different population sizes. And the black corresponds to a decline N0 generations ago. And you see that the distributions, the gray and the white are similar, but different from the black. And on the bottom panel, you see the power of a detection test based on this discrepancy. And you see that the power of the test hits like is virtually equal to 1 for dates of decline, which are of the order of between 0.1 and 10, and actually even larger than 50% for for a smooth and recent decline. So it requires good quality sequences, and because of what I just mentioned for PSMC, of course, we are also subject to this problem. This test is sensitive to population structure, and we are currently working on that. Now for chromosome painting, so remember this I think very elegant question, and you'll see a quite elegant answer also. So recall that the Wright-Fisher model with population size n and recombination probability rho over n, where rho now is equal to r, not to 1, sorry, is equal to r, but r is also the length of the interval. Okay, so basically it means that the recombination rate is still equal to 1 per unit length of the chromosome. Now you start with n individuals and you paint each of these n initial sequences with a different color, just as on the cartoon. After some fixed amount of time, you pick one individual at random and you ask, how does the mosaic of colors, which is the product of recombination acting during all this time, on this chromosome look like? And actually, exactly as what you said, Ivan, if all these individuals carry the same mosaic, then you can recombine them, you will find the same mosaic, okay? And so once everybody carries the same mosaic, the recombination has no action on it, okay? So there is a time after which everybody carries the same, what we call the fixed mosaic. And the question is, how does this fixed mosaic look like? So recall the ARG, the ancestor recombination graph. And recall that it can be described by a partition of 0R when you sample one individual. Okay, you just sample one individual here at the bottom. You trace back the lineages of all the sites, here 3 on the chromosome. You wait for, I don't know, maybe 20 generations. And at 20 generations, you look at which lineages are in the same ancestor. Here, they are all in different ancestors, and so the state of the partition here is into all singletons. Okay? But if you let this process evolve, you will see a partition of your chromosome also evolve. Okay? The question is, how does the fixed mosaic look like? So it means that instead of having 20 generations between the initial state and the final state, you have an infinite amount of state. So what it means is that by perfect duality between these two processes, the partition that you obtain, the mosaic that you obtain at fixation is the same as the stationary state of this process. Okay, so the fixed mosaic is given by the stationary distribution of this partitioning process that was actually previously studied by Esser, Probst, and Bakker. And actually, so it's a, I think, quite interesting process in its own right, where you have this partition into colors of your interval, and you have recombination occurring at rate 1. And so here, the cluster here in blue splits into 2, you get from bottom to top, splits into 2, on the left, it remains blue, but the colors are really not important, and left purple on the right. But also, of course, each pair of clusters can independently coalesce. And here on the bottom, you see the red and the green, which coalesce into one single cluster, which I painted red. But okay, and so what we obtained, it's actually I must say that it was mainly the work of Veronica Miropina and Emmanuel Scherzer, who co-supervised her, is the law of the cluster which contains 0. Okay, so you look at the color which is, say, red, the color which is at the left extremity of the chromosome, and you say that 0 is in relation with X if X position on the chromosome carries the same color. And you define the length of the cluster containing 0 as L sub R. And since we want actually even more information on where the red is distributed across the sequence, the chromosome, we define the measure theta R of AB, which is the amount of red between R to the A and R to the B rescaled by log R. And the theorem tells you that LR of a log R converges. Okay, so the total amount of red on the chromosome is of the order of log R, and when you rescale it, it converges. And more than that, theta R converges to a point measure, which gives you the locations of small segments and the total length that they represent. Okay, so it's the sum of yi delta xi, where xi, yr are the atoms of a Poisson point process with prescribed intensity. And so it's my last slide, so don't worry. I just want to explain the figure on the right. So the figure on the right tells you where is the red on the chromosome, and in the logarithmic scale, it tells you the theorem on the left tells you that the segments IPD with 0 are distributed according to this scale invariant Poisson point process with intensity 1 over x. So all these locations are the atoms of Poisson point process with intensity 1 over x. And the length of the segment at location r to the x is exponential with mean x times log r. Actually, the insert shows that there is a more complex geometry of these segments at the finer scale, which is not described by the theorem. And so you see on this picture that there is long-range dependencies between trees at different sites, because you see that you can recover some red at a very long distance from the left extremity. So maybe I will skip this. It's a conjecture about the number of ancestors contributing to the genome. And I will thank my two collaborators, Guillaume and Emmanuel Scharzer, Guillaume Achaz and Emmanuel Scharzer, and the two PhD students, Elise Carboncuff and Veronica Miropina, whose work I talked about. I will just browse across references just for the video. Don't pay attention. I'm going to go quickly through them, but then since it is recorded, I can do that. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me allow everyone to unmute themselves. You should be able to unmute yourself now. And if you'd like to join with me in thanking Amaray for an excellent lecture. And so before we'll take a little bit of time for questions. If people have to go, they can go. But let me just mention, and I put this in the group chat, that so the next lecture will be a week from now, the same time. It's not the same place in the sense that if you use the same link, it's not going to bring you to the right room. So this is a little complicated. So for each week, you need to register for that week. And the link for registration I sent, it's on the website. You can go to, here's the link to the overall website. We'll also try to send people a reminder of this. So each person will get an individualized link when they register, and that will be how you access the next talk. We'll also post the recording of this video as well as the slides on the website as well. So are there any questions for Amaray? You can just unmute yourself and ask if you have one.
I have a question regarding how the research on pattern matching, and say after the recombination occurs, and if there is a way to look backwards as one of the possibilities, and also within the transitions, if there's a way to keep track of those patterns, how they project towards the next, the next portion of the chain, and what other ways in general there's a tracking on this pattern matching and approximate pattern matching.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear very well. Ivan, could you repeat one of the two questions? I could hear there were two questions, but I couldn't really hear their content.
Okay, so basically I'm asking about the studies on pattern matching in terms of tracking the sequences, the DNA sequences, let's say after the recombination of chromosomes, and if there is a way to go backwards as well and track them, and also within within transitions, if there's a way to do that, like you were talking about, I believe, if I'm using the right term, among holotypes, and you know, within transitions from one stage to the other, that there were a sum of different mutations, if that's the term to use.
Yeah, yeah. So you're totally right. So a way of characterizing the diversity of the sample is to, so instead of like sampling from the distribution of the genealogy and then throwing mutations on it and try to infer the law of the diversity from this representation, this hierarchical representation. You can also have, like, there are methods that allow you to keep track of the state of either the population of or the ancestors of the sample at time t, and specify how this state varies through time. So this is something that can be done, for example, if you want to specify the distribution of SN, of the number of polymorphic sites. You can do that, or maybe SN of K. I think this is presented in Durrett's book. As for going backwards in time, I thought do you think of something different from the ancestral recombination graph?
Well, I'm just looking at the possibility of, if I can say, there is a correlation between the before and the after that can be typified probabilistically. That's the idea. Or none, there is no such a, there's always so many possibilities of pattern matching that that probability has to be really constrained to a formula because of its own complexity.
When you say before and after, you mean before and after on the chromosome? Before and after the end of an IBD segment, or?
After the recombination and prior to the, like if we look at families, and I think the idea is if we're looking at a disease, for example, and a scientist wishes to study pattern matching in relation to perhaps finding a specific gene as a cause, then is it possible to go backwards and identify probabilistically that is the cause of getting this recombination here, which is actually very associated with this disease? That's the idea.
Okay, I see. So yeah, so it's a let's say quite different topic where you will use the fact that recombination cannot occur everywhere all the time. And so there are variants, meaning sites which are polymorphic in the human population, some which are linked with the disease, or let's say causal in the disease, and some which are not, but which are linked together because of common ancestry and because of the fact that recombination between the two doesn't occur too often. And so this is what is done in GWAS, genome-wide association studies, is to find variants that are putatively, let's say that are on the first approximation, let's say neutral, not deleterious, but which are linked, which are carried by people who are more often than the others ill, and then to find map and try to sequence more precisely what occurs around this variant and find maybe the mutation which is causal, which has a responsibility in the disease. But I'm not sure I'm answering exactly the question. The mathematics in this field are a little less involved, and they, I don't think they, or most of them actually don't involve these models of the ancestral recombination graph. But I might be mistaken.
So there was a different type of question that was in the chat, which was just whether you can recommend any sort of fun exercises or any maybe something to reinforce what you were talking about today, whether there are particular things people should look at. And you gave quite a few references in the end. Is there any one in particular that has good exercises, for instance? That's the question.
It's in the chat?
Yeah, it was Giannis parentheses NYC.
I would say that the paper by View Van Hein I mean, it's an old reference, but which has a lot of information on this topic. But I'm not sure I got the question right actually. The sound is not so good. So
are there any other questions?
This question, little exercises. Okay. Okay, sorry. So maybe go to Dorret's book. Yeah, Dorret's book is full of exercises and details left to the reader and yeah, and funny stuff about this. Yeah, this kind of mathematical objects. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Are there any other questions before we end the session?
Perhaps a small question about the assumption that small n is much smaller than big N. I mean, for example, in the coalescence time for sample size small n, the probability of coalescence is n choose 2 over 2 capital N. So in that case, so that is derived from, I think it should be from the assumption that small n square is much smaller than big N. And so those pairs, the probabilities for those pairs to coalesce can be additive.
Yeah, you're right.
Just n smaller than
N. Yeah, actually, so n is fixed. Small n is fixed.
Pardon?
I think you can get results by letting small n go to infinity, provided, as you said, that n squared is much smaller than capital N. Okay. But all these results are for small n fixed.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, but you're right. You could be interested in the joint limit of both quantities go to infinity, provided that one of the two small n is reasonably smaller than capital N. Yeah.
Okay.
There might be papers on this topic. Yeah, if you can write me an email if you're interested.
So could you recommend any paper?
Can you send me an email? I have to check. I'm not sure that these papers do exist, but I can check if you want.
Okay. So maybe we should let Amore go and have a very nice dinner. I guess it's probably time for that. And those of us on the East Coast will go and have a nice lunch.
For the semi-final.
So, okay. So
yeah, semi-final of the French tennis open.
There we go. Okay. So, we'll see you all in a week. I'll try to send you a reminder and again, just instructions for how to get to the lecture next week. And again, we should be posting a video and the slides soon on the website. So we hope you take another look. All right. Well, thank you very much, Amore. We'll see you in a week.
Thank you. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.